It's a delight to see so many friends and colleagues here, as well as people that I haven't met, but it's a particular pleasure to have my co-author, Chris Milne, here in the audience. Originally, we weren't expecting that Chris was going to be able to make it. I'm delighted that he's here because any difficult questions, you can please direct them to Chris to be able to answer. Today, what I want to do is just set a little bit of the scene about the framing of this project, to look at some insight that we drew from the literature to establish some trends before exploring what was happening in Launceston, speak briefly about the Launceston context, and then look at some of the usage statistics for the shared e-scooters in Launceston before presenting some conclusions and identifying some of the areas where we think this research can go. Again, the earlier comment was preaching to the converted from our last speakers. I don't think the people in this room would need convincing about the fact that this is an industry that's grown, is growing, and is going to have a bigger dot on the radar screens of transport authorities all around the world. However, most of the experience that we're learning about internationally comes from very large cities. And we are starting to see the growth of shared micromobility in more regional communities. It's not immediately obvious that the experience that comes from very large cities is transferable when we go to a regional context, partly because the density of development's different, because the density and service levels of public transport are different. And the nature of public transport services is also very, very different. Some of the work that's reported in the literature is from cities that have got very sophisticated public transport systems. And so we saw an opportunity to try and add to our understanding a little bit of what happens with micromobility when it's taken into a more regional community. And we were able to do this project thanks to some data that was made available for Launceston. And so that allowed us to try and look at in what ways does the usage of these vehicles in Launceston compare with those in international cities. When I look at the insight from the literature, there's a few things that are quite common in what's coming out from comparisons of e-scooter use around the world. And that is that the time of day usage patterns are a bit different from what we've traditionally expected about movement in urban areas. So the strong morning and evening peaks are often not apparent. The morning peak, even if it's on the radar screen, is much lower, and demand tends to grow through the day, peaking late afternoon or into the evening. There's a fairly recent piece of work out of Europe that looked across 30 cities, was starting to explore whether there was an emerging AM peak. And this is something I think it's a touch point over time for returning from a research point of view to explore whether there is a growth in an AM peak commute demand. Weekday versus weekend usage. Again, one of the patterns in the literature is that weekend usage tends to be much higher than weekday usage. And so this often leads to a conclusion that there's greater recreational use of these vehicles than there is for utilitarian commuting purposes. But there's often a bit of conflict that we see in the literature because when users are asked, what are you doing on this vehicle, they often say that they're commuting. So there's a difference between what a user's saying versus what's the usage patterns. There's also been mixed evidence reported in the literature about whether they compete or complement public transport services. This varies by city and by mode, so the extent to which they complement or compete with bus services versus metros, it varies. One thing that's come out, particularly from some of the US literature, has been university campuses as drivers of demand. Now, in some cases, these are in what we would call university towns. In other cases, it's cities like Austin in Texas that are a reasonable sized town but have got very large campuses there, and that tends to be a hot point in terms of demand. Finally, and this reflects what's the emerging pattern of use of these vehicles, that they're being used for a trip that's too long to walk but not quite long enough to ride, at least in terms of the scooters. We do tend to see very skewed distributions, and I'll show you some of these in a minute, by time, by duration, by distance. A lot of short trips, very few long trips. So in this particular study, the four questions that Chris was doing the analysis to answer are: what are the characteristics in terms of summary statistics of usage of these shared e-scooters in Launceston? What's the temporal patterns in use? And do they vary across the week, particularly weekday versus weekend? What's the spatial distribution of the trips? So where are people using them? And how do those results compare to what we're seeing in the literature from other cities? So is there evidence that the regional context is different or similar to bigger cities? The data that were made available for this study was 2 months of ridership data. So details of every start and trip end time, distance and time ridden. There was some data cleaning undertaken because there were some very long trips that could be due to GPS error. There were some very fast trips, average speeds greater than 25 kilometres per hour, but the devices are limited to 25 kilometres per hour. Doing that data cleaning dropped off a bit less than 10% of the data. A little bit about the Launceston context. Public transport in Launceston is quite a linear network. It's a city that's very heavily car dominant. I would expect that most people that are using public transport are doing it not because they don't really have a good choice. They may not have a car. There is a University of Tasmania, it's got 2 campuses there, picking up on that comment I made from the literature, but they're relatively small campuses. And so unlike some of those situations described in the US literature, we weren't anticipating that university student demand was a big driver in Launceston. And you'll see from the public transport statistics that are there, public transport use is well below state and national levels in terms of commuting. It's appropriate for me to remark about the Tasmanian regulations, and I love this table. It just shows how much beautiful consistency we've got in micromobility regulation in Australia. But Tasmania allows both private and shared e-scooters, speed limited to 25 kilometres per hour, 15 kilometres an hour on a footpath, and they can be ridden elsewhere. So the data was made available by Beam. They've got a service area that's shown in the red line. It's a somewhat linear service area, suburbs in the south, the CBD in about the bottom third of that diagram, and then stretching up, one of the university campuses is about a third of the way to the north, going up to the northern suburbs. Heat maps were one way of identifying where are the hotspots for use of the e-scooters. So this is origins on the left, destinations on the right. And this was, when Chris produced this diagram, we both looked at it and thought, what in the hell is that red dot? Because it's north of the CBD area. Went back and checked the data. No, it doesn't look like there's an error. By having a discussion with the City of Launceston, it turns out that that red dot, which is just north of the river, is an area where there's a lot of free parking. So it's an easy place to get to and then use a scooter to get into the CBD. It's also close to a linear bike path that goes up along the river. So if you're wanting to use the scooter to go for a recreational ride, it's a really good place to go and pick up a scooter and then go for a ride along the river. So there was some logic to why it was a big red dot. Most of the activities around the CBD, it does stretch to the north. And looking at this by weekday and weekend, you can see that the CBD becomes a little bit more of a strong point as an origin on the weekend. Again, that dot just north of the CBD is consistently a hotspot at various times of day. Midnight to 5 a.m. And I'll show some time of day plots of usage in a moment, but very strong use around that CBD area where there's a lot of restaurants, clubs and the like that are closing down around that time. I mentioned before about the highly skewed distributions of use. So a lot of people use the scooters for relatively short trips. Average trip distance 2.3 kilometres. The average ride's about 15 minutes and the average point-to-point speed's about 9 kilometres per hour. And I'll come back to make some comparisons of these with international figures in a moment. By time of day, the Launceston data didn't show any evidence of an AM peak. usage tended to grow during the day and peaked in the evening at about 8 o'clock. Now, I remarked earlier about the fact that this data was from a 2-month period. We're looking forward to return to see when the vehicles have been available for a longer period of time and people's travel decisions get changed and locked in over time. There may be a change in this pattern, but this in itself was fairly typical of what happens in usage in other towns. When we look at use by day of week, you'll see that the two high curves on the right-hand side are Friday and Saturday. So that's when usage really peaks in the evening. The higher usage in the morning is Saturday morning and Sunday morning. So this data was suggesting that there is a lot of recreational use or going to and from recreational activities, potentially as opposed to commuting. Although I make the point that at the moment we're just looking at the ridership data, we haven't done surveys of these riders. It is possible that a number of those trips that are occurring in the early hours of the morning are from the people that are working at the pubs and clubs and they're trying to get home. So there can be commuting trips that are built in there from hospitality workers. Purely looking at weekday versus weekend, there was no statistical difference in the trip characteristics. Probably would be a bit different if we pulled out Friday, Saturday from other days, but pure weekday versus weekend, there wasn't a difference. Now, I remarked before that a lot of the evidence that's in the literature is from cities around the world that admittedly got quite different networks to Launceston. When we look at the Launceston figures, they're not substantially different from a lot of other cities in the world. The one that stands out in this table is Washington, DC. Washington's got quite a dense network of a metro, very extensive bus network, and so there is evidence that the scooter use in Washington is much shorter trips than we're seeing in Launceston. There is some evidence that, in this respect, Launceston may be slightly longer trips than in some towns, but not substantially different from some of the evidence in the literature. Now, I remarked about one of the things where there's been some varying results in the literature is about the role of micromobility in public transport, whether it competes or whether it complements. The Launceston public transport network comprises a number of routes, but the service levels are very poor. In this respect, they mirror what happens in many regional communities. It's fine during the day, but after about 10 o'clock at night, there's nothing. And for a lot of the weekend, it's an hourly service. Again, it comes back to my earlier point. If you had a car, you'd probably use it. You wouldn't use public transport by choice at service frequencies like that. One of the things that Chris was able to do was do a plot which showed usage by time of day as a function of the frequency of bus services. So when the bus service drops down to one service an hour, that occurs after 6 o'clock at night. What you see, it's quite dramatic out of this diagram, that at the time, once the public transport service falls off the cliff and you've got one service an hour, scooter use starts to really rise. And in the context of somebody who may not have a car or wants to get to their car, you're either going to walk, and again, that earlier point, it's for trips that are probably too far to walk. The other option would be an Uber or a taxi. And we didn't have data on it, but my expectation would be that in a smaller regional community like Launceston, the availability of those modes isn't going to be as great as in a CBD, in a major city. So this is suggesting that certainly the scooters are providing a mobility option for people at times of day when public transport service is, quite frankly, very poor. So what have we found from this? There's certainly evidence that these scooters are fulfilling a mobility need in a regional context. And I think that's an interesting space because what it highlights is that this is not just about big urban areas with dense city cores. I think we do need a deeper understanding of some of this. As I said, the data that we had for this study was only the usage figures for the usage stats for the e-scooters. Understanding more about the users and understanding more about the trips that they're undertaking would be very valuable. And also understanding what is their alternative mode. Would they have walked? would they have taken a car? Would they have taken a shared ride? And this is going to be an ongoing challenge of how do we manage these vehicles in this and many other communities and achieve a balance between the benefits and disbenefits to users and non-users. Finally, I just wanted to say a very big thanks to Tom and to Peter Ball and the Beam team. And also congratulations to Chris, because this data came on the scene very, very late. I was chewing my nails trying to get project data for Chris, and so it's sincerely appreciated that Beam came and helped us to get access to the data, because it produced a great project for Chris and hopefully something that some of you have found interesting today. Thank you.
Thank you, Geoff. Thank you. Thank you, Geoff and Chris. So we've got just under 10 minutes for questions. Is there anyone that has a question for either Geoff or Chris? Over here.
Hi, Kate McDonald from Hatch. I've actually just got a bit of anecdotal evidence. My previous company was headquartered in Launceston, and the staff in the office just love the scooters. They're saying it's actually changed the way they use the city, particularly in the evenings. Additionally, Launceston's the UNESCO City of Gastronomy, I think, this year. So people who travel for work are wanting to go out for dinner, and a lot of the hotels are not necessarily, they're quite a long, can be quite a long walk from where you might want to eat, and they're tending to want to try 2 or 3 of these popular restaurants while they're there. So they're using scooters a lot for visitor transport as well as the staff. Yeah, so it's a really interesting case study. Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
Any other questions? Right over the other side of the room.
Hi, Geoff. Stephen Coulter from Zippity. Tasmania, I guess, is lucky. Tasmanian citizens are amongst the 35% of Australians who are allowed to ride a privately owned e-scooter in their state. And in Europe, where the laws are more progressive, there's typically around 20 privately owned e-scooters for every shared e-scooter. Did you have any analysis or anecdotal evidence on the use of private e-scooters in Launceston?
We didn't, and that remains a bit of a black hole, I suppose. Not just in Launceston, but more broadly. You've only got to go out in the street and you see them used. But the beauty of working with the shared e-scooters is there's very rich data that's captured from the vehicle. We don't have that richness of data from the private e-scooters. There's some initial research being done, but part of the challenge is just recruitment and getting to the users of private e-scooters. But it will be a very interesting space, and also the relationship between whether people use a shared e-scooter and then make an informed decision about whether they'll purchase a private e-scooter, or whether a user of a private e-scooter when they travel is more inclined to use a shared e-scooter if they're in another city because they're familiar with the shared e-scooter.
Yeah, we're seeing a bit of both. We think initially people were buying private e-scooters under the limelight, quite literally. They'd ride a lime and then think this is fun, I'll use one and buy one. But around the world now we're seeing more and more IoT being integrated into privately owned e-bikes and e-scooters, and we think we'll end up with city clouds where you'll be able to see privately owned as well as the shared e-scooters, and a lot of the delivery bikes are going to have IoT as well. So the city will have a lot more information about all forms of micromobility, not just the shared rides that we're seeing today.
Hi, Mary Haviland from Arcadis, and I also live in regional Tasmania, so I'll declare that up front. And it's building on the question that you were just answering then, which is about the richness of the data. We know that many of our decision makers do have a cardinal bias, particularly when it comes to investment, as do our communities. How we find, and one of the positive outcomes of shared mobility is this rich data that's coming through about trips, about who's using it, etc. How has this data been acted as a Trojan horse for investment in infrastructure which benefits a wider range of micromobility users?
So, good question. I think that aspect goes a little broader than what I was looking at today. I can only draw on what I've seen and heard overseas. One of the biggest surprises for me in this space was when the shared e-scooters were emerging on the scene, and it's really not that many years ago. I was at the US Transportation Research Board conference, and there was a panel session on the scooters, and they had a couple of speakers from the bikes, what I'll call the bikes lobby in the United States. They were enthusiastic supporters. And the reason was that what the scooters provided was evidence of which routes people were taking to build the case to improve the infrastructure on those routes. I think there's a lot of opportunities here to get much richer understanding to help develop the links where there is evidence of demand to support those investment decisions.
Okay, one more question from the audience here, and then we've got an online question straight after that.
Hi. You mentioned, obviously, with regards to the legality changes around the country. The reason I was here is I was going to look at the potential of an e-scooter as a family Christmas present. So my kids, who have a fairly hilly trip to school and very heavy bags, they're responsible kids, 12 and 14, but it's not legal under 16. Are there places, I'm assuming not in Australia because we're behind the curve, where do we see a future where kids can use these? Because it feels like there's this idiot-led idea that kids are going to be irresponsible, but we clearly let idiots drive cars.
The whole area of regulation is a very rich one. From memory, there's a session on this afternoon that's dealing with regulatory issues. At the moment, I don't see a lot of discussion around the age aspect. And in fact, I didn't even tabulate that. I suspect it's fairly similar across Australia. And yeah, the pace of change of regulation is about the speed of slow treacle on a very, very slightly inclined board. It's painful. It's painfully slow. But I think there's going to be a lot of pressure in the system for some change.
Great. So we've got an online question, and just a reminder to those people that are live streaming, you can ask questions as well. So thanks for the presentation, Geoff. Cam and Uriel from the City of Launceston here. We would love to catch up for a chat and talk about some recent data if there is an opportunity. We've seen a lot of change for the past 7 or 8 months that might be of interest for you to hear about.
Yeah. Great.
From Cameron Smith. So more a statement.
Okay, thank you, Cameron. I think that picks up on an important point. The data that we had available for this study was some early experience data. We want to revisit because some of those commuting patterns will take time to evolve. One of the things we know from the theory of travel behaviour is that people don't make every travel decision every morning. They commit longer term to some bigger mobility decisions, and the commute to work trip is generally one that they make a longer term commitment to. People may not embrace a scooter as an option as part of that unless they think that the scooter's really going to be there for more than just a couple of weeks. And so that's where, looking back over time, we'd certainly expect to see that we'll see differences in these patterns as some of those longer term decisions start to embrace the scooter.
Fantastic. I'm happy to squeeze one more question in if there's anyone else in the audience with a question.
Hi, I'm Surendra from Transport for New South Wales. I just have one question. I think vandalism is one of the most deterring factors for any shared micromobility, as in e-scooters or e-bikes and all. So was there any study done as part of that, to understand how to handle it, especially in regional areas when traffic goes almost to zero in the evening times? Vandalism could occur. So how do you plan to handle that one?
That's potentially a very important issue. The data that we were looking at had nothing to do with the vandalism. I don't have any evidence around that, but speaking to some of the operators that are here, they may have some insight. My perception is that the robustness of the shared scooters has improved a lot from the models that were introduced initially a couple of years ago, where if you looked at them sideways, they'd crack. The newer varieties are much more robust for the knocks and spills that normal users will give them, as well as what some idiots will throw at them.
Thank you. Thank you, Geoff. Thank you for some great questions as well. Geoff, your copy of Jill's Joyful Ride.